Obviously, there's been lots of talk recently looking at recovery in terms of COVID, trying to understand the impacts on our local communities. And we know social enterprises have stepped up in a lot of our local communities in terms of responding. We also know it's going to be a massive challenge for many of them from an economic and financial perspective. So our session today is really trying to take a look at some of the data that's been collected, and Kirsten from Social Investment Business is going to talk us through some consumer data that they've been tracking that, if you're a bit of a data geek like me, you'll find fascinating, but really starts to give us an indication of communities that from an economic perspective are really potentially struggling and will take time to recover, and also hopefully pulling up some positive notes as well. We talked about that, so we don't want to leave a doom and gloom session with you today. And then we're going to be hearing from Ailsa and Sue, who are over in Argyll and Bute from Inspiralba, really to give us that kind of real life perspective, on the ground perspective. So it's not just all about the data, we need to know the stories and what's actually happening on the ground too. And then we're going to hand over as our last speaker to Thomas, who's over in Uist out in the Outer Hebrides, and going to give us that perspective. And I know both Ailsa, Sue and Thomas all have a really good understanding of that island and rural community as well, so I think you'll get a sense of that coming through their presentation. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Kirsten for this first session, and over to you, Kirsten.
Great. Let me get this all set up and do my slideshow. So, hello everyone. I'm excited to be here today. I'm Kirsten and I'm from Social Investment Business. I thought I'd start off today. I've got kind of 20 to 25 minutes to say kind of who SIB is and what CoDeL is, why we've been mobilizing social economy data, how we're doing it, and importantly, what we found so far in relation to Scotland, and what does that mean. So who is SIB? So SIB is a social investor and fund manager, and essentially we seek to deploy finance in pursuit of fairer communities. We do that through 3 different channels, and the third of which really is using our knowledge to help to inform our own work and the work of others, and hopefully using that to really influence where resources is going. And CoDeL is the Social Economy Data Lab, and that's essentially our data hub, which is where I work. I'm head of CoDeL, and we support the social economy to access this data and then also use it to hopefully make better decisions. And why we think this is so important right now is that we believe that data can help to effectively prioritize limited resources during times of crisis. So COVID in particular, we know that we have limited resources, and we are interested in prioritizing those in the right way to get to the most vulnerable communities that are suffering currently. So SIB through CoDeL has been working with a number of different data partners to access, share, collaborate, and really to understand what type of data we need to get to better understand the effects of on communities of COVID, and how we can start to articulate what vulnerability looks like and where the differences in the COVID effect might be occurring, and really importantly why. So I've included, and we'll share all these slides afterwards, I've included some other links to other really helpful social economy data sets out there as well. One to highlight really is the British Red Cross. They've got an amazing pre-COVID vulnerability index, which I know does extend to Scottish regions as well, at a really very granular level. So we've been using their data ourselves too. And ultimately, the main aim for us is to provide real-time data to inform what changing vulnerability looks like as the COVID crisis unfolds. Secondly, to use that data to identify those that are most vulnerable. Thirdly, to then understand why some areas are more vulnerable and experiencing larger shocks than others, and bring all of that together to hopefully inform some of the emergency responses to COVID so that they're designed and directed to reach those most in need. And ultimately, we know that COVID is not a short-term thing. It's going to be around for a while. So to figure out how to use that information and what we've learned as a social economy and as a system to do kind of support long-term needs for those communities over the upcoming months and years. And I'm talking a lot about local economy vulnerability. And I just wanted to highlight that, you know, there's different types of vulnerability, but we're predominantly looking at economic vulnerability. Importantly, health vulnerability is particularly important, as is social and infrastructure. But there's some other great data partners out there that are doing some work on that. So just to put into context, we're looking at the economic side. In particular, the data set that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today is on consumption spending or consumer spend. transaction card level data, and using that to understand how money is changing and the flow of money is changing in these areas. We then also, it's useful to understand the employment landscape in those areas when you're looking at economic vulnerability, as well as the economic sectors of concentration. So your retail area, tourism, rely on tourism, more financial, and then obviously a little bit on what be emerging in terms of accessing current economic support packages is also important to understand as we track in future. So I'm nearly done with some of the technical stuff, but just to give you a little bit of a background to where this data is coming from that I'm about to show you. We get our data, so CoDeL gets it from a company called Infoku, and essentially they compile and clean and scrape data from 6 different card and bank sources. So kind of essentially tracking what an individual credit card spend is on which area at which merchant. We can't see people, so I can't see myself in the data set, for example, but I can see a Sainsbury's or a local merchant where that money has been spent. And one of the big ones actually is RBS that we get that data from. The other thing to note is that it represents only around 13 to 33% of the total spend. So we're not really interested necessarily on the value of money that's circulating, because we only got a portion of the transaction book, if that makes sense. But we're really interested in behavior change. So how, if people are spending less now than they were previously, if they're spending more, which groups are doing that, etc. And I guess also just to say that, 13 to 33% is still millions of transactions every week. So it's still a very large data set that we're using. Yeah, so I think that's okay. And then the last one, sorry, on the, I don't know if that's a question. I'm going to keep on going. The last one is just to say that we have started creating outputs. So this project is something we started at CoDeL over the last 3 to 4 months. And we've got a bunch of different outputs in trying to share this data as widely as possible. So I'm planning on sharing all of those links with you afterwards, but it kind of involves media partnerships where the data is up and tracking weekly shocks and consumer spending, some deeper dive analysis and blogs to understand what that means for the social investment and social enterprise worlds. A little bit of interactive play on data maps and tracking of community funds, well, not community funds, but of social investment funds that we've started to deploy through SIB, a little bit, so that openness and transparency of data is also a key to what we're doing. So that was a whirlwind of what it was. Now I think the interesting part is what we are finding. So this graph really shows us that between the 14th of March and the 27th of April, spending around the whole of the UK dropped significantly, so about 40% on average. I'm just moving that around so you can see. But it has started to increase since that kind of pivotal change at the bottom, and we almost now back up to pre-COVID spending levels. That was quite interesting to us, and we are looking to continue tracking this data to see if that's maintained or if there's been a bit of a surge, but also just to say that this is across the full UK on average. So across at a UK average, things took a big hit and we've actually started to recover. However, I'll talk a little bit later that recovery has not been equal. And that's why it's so important to have this data. So what I decided to do is talk a little bit about what we saw at the start of lockdown and what we're seeing currently. And the couple of slides now is what we saw in the start. So we saw that people's spending patterns have changed quite significantly in large towns. There's 10 large towns and also some of the smaller towns along the coast. And really the link between where spending has been declining has been linked to retail, hospitality and tourism. So just quickly before, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of different data points, when we say spending has declined, essentially what we're tracking is the kind of total card spend of this month compared to the total card spend of the same month in 2019, and tracking the change, the percentage drop or increase or decrease. So if now in the month of April, people are spending 40% less than they were current spending in the month of April in 2019, that's our comparison. Yeah, so small coastal towns are being largest hit there. And actually, if I can go back, I think I missed it, but also just to highlight on that one of the big towns, some of the university towns were getting hard hit as well. So I think Oxford had a drop of about 60% in the early lockdown phase there in consumer spending. This is a map that you can also go and access on the CoDeL website. And of course, yeah, it's basically the interesting part here is to really reflect, we've selected from the British Red Cross vulnerability data, those areas that were already pre-existing rated as the most vulnerable before COVID. And those happen to be a little bit more on the coast, as you can see there. There's only the areas that are reflected, and there's some there in Scotland as well. And really what we've seen in coastal communities is that because of their high reliance on tourism, retail, hospitality, the main sectors that have been hit, as well as their pre-existing vulnerability, we kind of knew that coastal towns were left behind, I think is the term that has been bandied around before COVID. They're almost experiencing a bit of a trifecta. So we're very aware of this has been one of the national and national average, what we've been seeing. So then to compare a little bit of what we're seeing in Scotland. So everything that I've been saying has kind of been at the UK level. Between April and May, you could see that London was probably the best performer of the lot, although there was obviously a big drop for everyone, starting off at around 20% decrease in sales in April, and then moving up to around 11% for London in May. So kind of streaks ahead actually above the other regions. And I think importantly, most people on this call is what happened in Scotland. And in April, there was a significant spending cut in Scotland as a region, down to around 40% there. That was the shock. And then by May, kind of recovered a bit, but still at minus 30%, which is, you know, a very substantial knock to the economy. I think it is only the northeast that actually was one below. So it's also interesting to understand the different regions. And that it's not been, you know, the national average is not led by London, but actually different areas are experiencing different things. If we look to where the spending happens, we can split by total sales, which is the main graphic in the middle, or the dark blue graphic, which is kind of the middle one. And we calculate total sales as grocery sales plus other. And that's really important because during COVID, there's basically been a boom in grocery sales. You can see there it's kind of fluctuating between, it started a little bit low, but basically fluctuating between the 30 and 40% mark for Scotland, which obviously brings up those huge drops in other sales to kind of a middling out at around the minus 40% for total sales change that we've seen in the early stages of lockdown. And this kind of huge boost in grocery sales has been seen across all regions. It's very consistent with all the data. And I think probably all of our experiences of how much we're shopping at our local stores for groceries. I won't get into too much detail here because I think everyone's going to be particularly interested in their own local economies, but we are able to split by ward. And it's up on the Corona Shock Tracker on Tortoise. And essentially what we saw in the beginning was places like Oban, for example, getting hit kind of the highest on the list there of the biggest decreases. And that was 69% drop overall, which is crazy. You can see the second column refers to all the grocery, and that's more green. So some of those total sales drops being offset by more spending on groceries, for example. So some of the detail of the data is there as well. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to click there. But what is really important now actually is what are we currently seeing? So I'm going to do that quickly. Sorry, I don't know what I'm pressing here. So we're starting to see that, let me go back. Oh no, don't know if I can go back on my slides. There we go. So we're starting to see that spending has returned. And as I said, at a national level, we're almost back to just almost at zero again, so kind of at the same level of pre-COVID spend, but actually just minus 5% there. But that's actually not been represented equally across England, Scotland and Wales. We haven't been able to include Northern Ireland for small sample sizes. But Scotland really experiencing the largest drop there, and this is looking for between May and June, coming off a base of around minus 30% there that we spoke about earlier, and managing to recover following a similar pattern to both England and Wales, but still actually ending off at minus 17% there as the most current figures on the 16th of June. So really still tracking quite a lot below the other regions. Which is really important for us to understand when we start to prioritize how COVID responses and resources are used in different areas. And I think then the other important point to make note of in this data is that we can also track who is spending and who is declining where, for example. And this is kind of the Cameo data set, which tells us who are the more affluent spenders and who are those that are from lower income groups. And really what this graphic shows us is, this is all again for Scotland, Scottish data, that really shows us that the business elite, I'm seeing things coming up here. I don't know if somebody's asking me a question or if you can't hear me or something. I'm just going to keep on going. Otherwise, Naomi, you pop up with your face if it's something I need to take notice of. Sorry. So the point here is that more affluent spenders are not bouncing back as much as those in lower income groups. So what this graph shows us, the green at the bottom is the business elite, and the blue at the top is the family value. And essentially all those other color coordinate colors are almost tracking nearly identically in order of those going from low income to high income. And essentially we saw that the business elite dropped their expenditure immediately and most drastically, but the important part is that they've been the least, the smallest group to start to recover, they're recovering to the smallest degree, in the sense that still in June they're at around minus 30% of spend. So they haven't just gone back to spend what they were previously spending in the pre-COVID times, which is really a concern a little bit for the lower wage jobs, because it's your business elite spending on kind of wants, not needs, that create the restaurant jobs, the hospitality jobs, and the lower wage jobs in particular. So that becomes really important to understand how we think about the economic restructure and what might be happening in terms of purchasing powers within those communities. And so this is the Scottish data, but also to say it's the same pattern that's been tracked across the whole of the UK as well. To get to some of the nuance of the data, most so to say that we have seen the similar trends across the local authorities, that those areas in hospitality, travel, tourism, concentrated sectors are experiencing the biggest drops and have still not really regained back to their pre-COVID levels as of June. So, you know, even Scotland has recovered as a region up to that 17%, negative 17%, I think, but within that, there's still a huge amount of discrepancy. And Aberdeen City, for example, is still at negative 40%. So spending is maintained and tracked, you know, consistently over those 3 to 4 months of a COVID hit. I won't get into all of the different details here, but really just to also reflect that it's some of the big cities that in Scotland that are among this list, and Glasgow, Edinburgh is there. So those centres are also getting hit by this kind of travel and the tourism and hospitality declines as well, and we think that is probably most likely to some sort of decrease in footfall as well. So people are not moving as much, etc. And also to say, compared to kind of a London inner city, there isn't as much reliance on the financial sector trade where people are able to do that more remotely. We have found some good news, and that there are some positively affected local authorities as well. I'd be really interested to understand from the speakers coming up and yourselves why we think that might be the case, because I don't know the Scottish regions as well as all of you do, and I might embarrass myself by my pronunciation now by saying that Clackmannanshire has kind of topped the list there, and by June that they had recovered up and actually benefiting from increased spend compared to the same period last year. So consumers spending more by up to 18%, which is quite interesting. Obviously probably led there by the localization of spend, potentially some positive offshoot from grocery spending as well. But we'd have to drill down into those local economies to really know all of the nuances there. And that's what we've done for two in particular, so two areas. And one of our speakers, I think, will focus on Argyll and Bute later, which is also why I thought it was helpful to look at this. And I've kind of compared the Argyll and Bute Council with City of Edinburgh Council. And you can see the top positive sales change is all around groceries, and the bottom is really all around total. So we are interested in the total sales, which are tracking in the negative regions there. But it's useful to see that grocery sales, across both of those regions have maintained its boom, if that makes sense. So when we were first looking at the data, we expected huge grocery increases and spikes because we saw consumer behavior changing, but actually in the grocery sector, all those that operate in and sell groceries, and for those merchants, that increase in spend has actually tracked and continued to maintain at those kind of 30 to 40% levels, obviously fluctuating as people get income. So you can see in May and week 2 of the two top lines, kind of a little bit of a peak probably as people get disposable income in and go and buy their groceries, and then dropping down a little bit, but actually kind of fluctuating quite highly there between the 30% line. Another thing to say there really is that both Argyll and Bute and City of Edinburgh have increased, inched upwards from a lower base and a bigger drop in spending in May week 2 to June week 2. So we're only actually looking over a 1 month period here. So to say it's quite specific. But when we start to look at the different nuances in these council areas now, I think it becomes important to understand them a lot more. So my understanding, and again, I think the panelists will be much better placed to explain some of the local effects at play, but Argyll and Bute would be a lot more reliant on tourism trade kind of being part of the coastal, being a coastal community themselves, and really just highlighting the effect then that what we're worried about for coastal in particular, and those that are reliant on tourism, is that a drop now might mean that income for a whole year, so basically experiencing a huge drop during your summer season, might mean that you're actually experiencing a whole drop for an entire year's worth of income for some of those merchants that rely on seasonal trade linked to tourism. So we see that both of them are increasing, which is good. Obviously, still below pre-COVID levels of spend. But I think that the hypothesis is perhaps that City of Edinburgh would continue to increase upwards as things start to open up again. But the worry is that those coastal areas like Argyll and Bute might not see that same increase if tourism doesn't come back to the pre-existing levels. And actually, tourism in the winter months isn't going to be sufficient to make up for the losses in summer months. So those are the type of things that we start to think a little bit about. And really, what does this all mean? I think it means that we know that purchasing power within an economy is critical. So if you know that you are in a more affluent area with more stable jobs and weren't kind of left behind pre-COVID, you have a better chance of having an economic multiplier effect within your economy. So essentially, having high income earners spending money, getting that moving in the economy, creating employment, and almost helping a local economy get itself out of a recession. But what we are seeing from the data is that affluent spending isn't necessarily happening as we might have expected as lockdown starts to kind of ease up. In part, it might be because lockdown restrictions have been different across regions, and I think that's a really interesting thing to start looking at and tracking in the data. But it just means that from what we're reading from this, from the social economy point of view, is that we have some stark income inequalities that are happening as a result of COVID, along with some health inequalities as well. And we think it's really the job for social economy players to start to look after both the people and the places in the short term and in the long term as things start to continue. So really important to track this and to see what else does happen, what other trends are we starting to see. And CIB's position really is that the social investor and funding responses should be targeting those most vulnerable communities by really focusing on that social economy of good employment and income, because using that and to stimulate what might not be happening by those affluent spenders or in areas that are now losing jobs and are facing kind of these bigger challenges, and how as we as social investors can really start to target good employment and income. And we have kind of some principles there on investing in fair economy and what that means and what we think that means. But I am going to kind of hand over to the rest of my speakers to tell us hopefully what the data also can tell to social enterprises, how it could be used, and maybe explain a little bit more as to why we might have seen some of the changes across those different communities. I think one thing from our side is that we can see what's happening and we can draw out analysis and generalized findings, but it's really interesting to understand specific business models and the local stories so that we understand together as a social economy how we can start to mitigate and get out of it in future. Thanks.
Thank you, Kirsten. There's so much in there in terms of, I've got heaps of questions, I have to say, which is always encouraging, and I can see them starting to come through. I'm conscious we've got still 2 speakers to fit in and we want to make sure there's time for questions. I know speakers are happy to stay on slightly after 12:30, but I want to make sure we've got time for that. So I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, and Ailsa and Sue are both going to talk us through what they've seen on the ground in Argyll and Bute, I think picking up on some of the data points that Kirsten has highlighted and just showing us what the impacts have been on social enterprise in their area. So over to you, Sue and Ailsa.
Thanks, Naomi. Sue, if you unmute. That's you. Oh, you've just muted again. No.
Now I'm unmuted, I think. Yeah? Okay. Thanks very much, and fascinating presentation, Kirsten. And I guess what we're focusing on is, the Argyll and Bute, looking at a specific area. And we're going to, what we're going to do is we're just going to set a bit of context to start with. We're going to pull out some of the issues that have come out of discussions that we've been having with rural social enterprises in Argyll and Bute, but also more widely across rural Scotland. I want to share a little bit about some of the social enterprise responses in Oban, particularly, because that was one of the areas that Kirsten had identified. And Ailsa's going to speak mainly around responses in Campbelltown. And then some ideas in terms of how we move towards economic growth. And I think that's kind of part of the discussion that's bubbling up across rural Scotland. And and there's some really important ideas to share there. And I think Thomas will pick up on those as well as we go forward. So just to run through fairly quickly, can you see my screen now? So social enterprise in Argyll and Bute, that's what we're going to be looking at. And just to give you a sense of the geography, I think most people in Scotland will know where Argyll and Bute is, but just in case, what we know about it is it's huge, it's large, it's rural, it's remote, and very important in terms of what Kirsten's been talking about, it's coastal. So it's stunningly beautiful, it's a great place to live, but has particular issues in terms of its local economy. In terms of social enterprise, there are 246 social enterprises in Argyll and Bute, which is 4.4% of all the social enterprises in Scotland, which means there's a high percentage per number of the population. And this high level of social enterprise is reflected very much across rural Scotland, and that's one of the issues that we're working on in developing the hub for rural social enterprise. Just some vital stats about Argyll and Bute. Again, maybe many of the people on this call already know these, but it's the second largest authority in Scotland. It's got an 85,500 population, fourth sparsest population, 23 inhabited islands. Interestingly, in terms of Kirsten's material on coastal communities, 79.7% of Argyll and Bute's population live within 1 kilometre of the coast, and 52% of the data zones are amongst the most geographically access-deprived data zones in Scotland. In terms of the local economy, it's a service-based local economy. We've got 83% of employment in services, higher than average employment in agricultural, forestry, fishing, tourism, really important, and low levels of manufacturing and finance. So very much fitting the model that Kirsten's been talking about economies that are likely to be impacted. Those are the percentages. We've got higher levels of self-employment and higher levels of part-time seasonal employment. And thus we've got employment levels that really fluctuate. And that's going to have an impact, I think, going forward. In terms of Oban itself, Oban, Lawn and the Isles, its largest sectors in terms of employment are accommodation, food services and health. So again, fits this model of a largely service-based economy, and also largely reliant on tourism. In terms of wages are on average across Argyll and Bute lower than the Scottish average. And as we've been saying, employment's often seasonal and dependent on tourism. So it very much fits that description of a coastal community. And in terms of consumer spend, areas where people have, if people need to come to your area to spend money, that's going to be an issue in terms of Argyll and Bute currently. So key issues that have come through in terms of the impact of COVID within the discussions that have been going on within the local social enterprise communities. The first issue is one of that rediscovery of local. So people have been shopping locally, local businesses and social enterprises have stepped up to the mark in terms of people being able to access what they need and their basic necessities. And also there's been quite a move, certainly in this area, looking at local producers, actually looking at how they might change some of their supply chains and change the ways that they're actually selling their produce. So a lot more local sales of local produce happening. And that might be interesting in terms of the consumer data, because that may not necessarily be coming through in terms of that, I think. The other big issue that's coming through is everyone's become very aware of the crucial role of economic development to future community well-being, both now and in the future. And social enterprises are seen to have a key role in terms of taking this forward. And the third key area has been this issue in terms of the local economy and how we restart the local economy, and the heavy reliance on tourism and what that's going to mean in terms of how people feel about the sustainability and safety of tourists coming back to the area. And there's quite a lot of local debate about what alternative models of tourism may be available, and how do we move to more sustainable models of tourism that actually make the most of sort of local and natural resources, but also keep local communities safe in the post-COVID economy that we're moving towards. So we've been working at Inspiralba setting up a hub for rural social enterprise, and on that hub, you'll see the website address in the corner of the slide. On that hub, we've actually been collecting some of the stories of what's been happening locally, and in terms of Oban, there are sort of three key areas I think that are worth highlighting. The first has been the speed of response by local social enterprises. So Hope Kitchen that delivered, that was involved in addressing food poverty and making food available locally within Oban initially, decided that they would expand their service, and within about 4 days were able to expand to the whole of the Oban and Lawn area, which is quite a substantial area. The official Argyll and Bute and Scottish Government service took somewhat longer to get up and running. It was about May by the time that was running, and Hope Kitchen were already able to respond in much more quickly. So that agility and speed of response, I think, has been an issue. The other issue worth highlighting is flexibility. So there's another social enterprise in Oban, the Rockfield Centre, who are developing a cultural community hub within the city, within the town. They very quickly took on a role as a community anchor organisation and looked to channel funds into the area and into local organisations. They made space for a PPE project. They set up a micro food bank in a phone box, and are now operating as a pickup point for orders from local food producers as well. So channeling some of that energy as well. And also other organisations such as Lawn and Oban Healthy Options have been restructuring their delivery models to actually see what they can do in terms of continuing to provide health information and exercise and health intervention for people locally. So social enterprise really at the forefront of the local economy to start with, but actually in the COVID situation have been able to sort of respond with speed, agility and flexibility. Moving forward, and I think Naomi wanted us to think about sort of where we see recovery as coming from. I think how, you know, in terms of how we're going to get economic growth, very much a discussion within the Rural Social Enterprise Network and other networks is the idea that, you know, there needs to be a focus on community well-being and a move to a well-being economy, and one that focuses not just on economic objectives but also social and environmental ones as well. Very much a focus on the investment in young people and how we make young people central to the developments as we go forward. And one of the other issues that has come through, both through our work and also work by other organisations such as Scottish Rural Action, has been that digital infrastructure has been absolutely crucial to what people have been able to achieve over the last few months, and will be absolutely crucial to moving forward. So I think overall the need to recognise that rural areas have, vast natural resources. They're absolutely amazing places to live. They have strong communities willing to step up to the plate, but will actually need the resources and the backup and support that will enable them to take forward the kinds of developments that they want to see. And really crucial that communities are at the centre of that development. And I know the Scottish Government's Scottish Government's report on, the post-COVID economy, and where speaks a lot about the importance of place-based approaches and then building on the natural assets and what's available within local communities, and that's going to be really, really important going forward. Ailsa, I'm going to pass over to you. I've waffled enough.
Thanks, Sue. If you want to flick on to the next slide, just so
yeah, of course I can.
Details on that as well. Thanks, Sue. That's really helpful setting the context and giving some of the open examples. I thought it'd be useful just from someone from Rawcliff originally to kind of set some of the context there and some of the nuances within that rural geography. Each of our towns and villages have very different senses of their own community and different natures. So Oban is, as Sue said, heavily reliant on tourism, and I'm sure that's a major factor. It's also gateway to the islands in terms of people travelling. So a lot of people from the islands would visit Oban to shop and things as well as visitors to the islands stopping by there. I think Rawcliff has particular nuances in that it's the public sector capital of Argyll, so there's a huge amount of commuter traffic that normally travels to Rawcliff for work, and during this epidemic, obviously with home working, a lot of that spend is therefore not likely to be happening in Rawcliff because people are working from home wherever that might be. So just really reflecting on some of the slides with some kind of local information in relation to that. But I think also reinforcing some of what Sue was saying in recognising that social enterprises have very much been at the front line of local resilience. And the feedback from the Social Enterprise Network Scotland Reset Week activity, highlighted that very clearly, as well as did our Rural Reset Week session that we held. I think it's important to recognise the importance of localism and how social enterprise fits within that, and those examples in terms of social enterprises supporting resilience activities, whether that's delivering food, ensuring people have access to technology, have been similar both in the rural and the urban context. So, I'm very aware from colleagues that work in a more urban setting that those locally based social enterprises have been playing an important role in getting those measures out to their communities, and that has been very apparent in our local context here as well. I guess in terms of stats and some learning from the current period, a lot of our previous measures have valued success in social enterprise terms based on turnover and profit ratios, and also in terms of trading to grant ratios. And I think what's been demonstrated recently that actually a lot of social enterprises, perhaps more so in a rural context as well, have to be reliant on a complex package of income streams with both grant, donations and trading income. And that and their resilience and their ability to deliver to need is not less effective because those ratios are different. So I think some of those success measures probably have to be revisited in the current context. I think also in terms of resilience, we've also seen stats which demonstrate resilience being based on that purely economic model. But actually, from a rural context, some of our most long established social enterprises, I mean, we have examples from Argyll that have been going for over 100 years, and they wouldn't necessarily score high on some of those traditional measures. But actually what's important is that focus on community well-being, and that resilience is intrinsic in that, and therefore those income streams can vary depending on local need, and that has been shown through with the current context as well. Again, that focus on well-being, I think, places social enterprises in a hugely important context as we move forward. And I think Sue also highlighted that in Argyll, as some of those measures have come into place that are led by the public sector, there's perhaps less of a recognition of the importance of social enterprise, so we still have more work to do there. But we certainly have a huge number of examples from local communities where that resilience effort has been so important over the recent months. And from my location in Campbelltown, we've seen the local resilience efforts be able to turn things around quickly and in response to needs. So for example, working with partners in Campbelltown, we identified very quickly that whilst all the educational provision was moving to a digital framework, many of our families in the town didn't actually have access to digital tools. So we were able to initiate a refurbishing and reuse IT project, and then with our contacts across Scotland, we're able to link with Reusing IT based in Livingston to secure laptops, and that was picked up, although it was a local initiative, it was picked up by colleagues across Argyll, and we've circulated somewhere in the region of 200 odd laptops to families across the area. And yes, setting that in context as well, you know, being conscious that the Connecting Scotland activity is now taking place, but you know, we're 3 months on and kids have been able to engage with their learning all the way along, whilst I guess the national picture catches up a wee bit. I think one of the things that's really important to know is during the challenges that we've faced recently, collaboration has been hugely important. And I think at a local level, whilst, you know, there's always kind of nuances and personalities and a wee bit of infighting that goes on, people were able to put their egos aside and just roll their sleeves up and say what needs done and let's get it done. And I think that's been really evident in the success of a lot of the activity from a local setting as well. I think that's also evident in terms of that collaboration, sharing information and making sure resources are kind of targeted most effectively and most efficiently, using everybody's skill and capability within the local context. I don't know if that's always been so successful from a national perspective, and I'm certainly aware of organisations that have had multiple agencies contacting them about grant funding. So I think there's learning there as well from that local context in terms of effective collaboration and how we learn from that. So moving on, I would say social enterprises have proven their stripes during the recent months and have demonstrated that value of localism and community well-being. And I think our role is in how we can help shape that moving forward. So yeah, a huge amount of learning, and perhaps a need to look at how we measure success within that broader context of community wealth building as well. Thanks, Naomi.
Thank you, Ailsa. Conscious we've still got to hear from Thomas. It was really interesting, I think, to have that sense from Argyll and Bute coming in to kind of add to the data, and again, a few comments when we come into the questions at the end. But what I don't want to do is end up cutting Thomas short. So we will be taking questions past 12:30 today. We'll go on a little bit longer because I know we'll have lots to hear from Thomas as well, and we will just add on an extra 15 minutes onto today's session for Q&A. So over to Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to follow on from Sue and Ailsa's presentation on Argyll and Bute, because much of what they say, of course, is applies to the Outer Hebrides and the islands generally. And as you saw, 17% of the Argyll and Bute population actually lives on islands. So I don't need to provide that kind of background on how islands have responded to the COVID crisis as much as I would otherwise have done. So I think one thing to say to start with is that many islands have actually fared well in terms of COVID infections. And the key factors are obviously the ability to restrict travel. Islands are also great places to be. You can get out in the stunning environment in spite of lockdown. You have close-knit communities looking after each other. And you have economies which are often geared towards well-being more than some other economies. The quotes you see there are drawn from the SRA, that's Scottish Rural Action's rural communities surveys on COVID-19, which are really good, over 500 of their members across rural Scotland. The power and efficacy and responsiveness of localism, building on what Sue and Ailsa said there. And it's a collective whole community effort. That's really important. The surveys also draw out the role of local businesses have been fundamental, but even though we're talking about the local economy, it is important to stress how islands have responded well to the COVID crisis, partly because of that collective whole community effort, public sector, private businesses, community organizations, social enterprises, all working quite well together. There is certainly, we have benefited from a can-do attitude on islands, and I'm sure that applies to many rural areas as well. And I just picked up a quote from the Isle of Föhr in Germany. People on the island use what is available and do not wait for the capital's decisions. And one example of that, the islands, we're working also with Irish islands, and they closed their islands for non-essential travel even before the Irish government had imposed lockdown. To see that can-do attitude on the islands, isle20.com was set up by a social entrepreneur in Tyree and is now listing over 400 island businesses. And indeed, there's some mainland businesses who have island connections who are trying to get in there, because that has been a very successful response in allowing some of those island businesses to continue trading, even though there are no visitors on the island. Some place like Callan Harbour on Grimsay, which is the largest fishing harbour on Uist, has quickly shifted to local sales. I'm not sure the figures, that probably won't have made up for their exports, but they have got some critical business from local sales. And then North Uist Distillery is another example, which was set up by two young entrepreneurs recently, quickly shifted into producing hand sanitizer for local sale, and that's been distributed all across Uist. So again, that resilience, that agility that our communities have. Obviously, we're fragile. And although we're focusing on the local economy, we must say that there are very limited health facilities, especially if and when COVID-19 arrives. Many islands have not had COVID cases yet. But when they do come, then our health facilities are very limited, and it's going to be very challenging. As Kirsten at the beginning said, trade is very seasonal, so it's hugely challenging for businesses, social enterprises, community organizations that generate most of their income in the summer. And that is not just annual income, but it also allows many of them to carry on trading, even at a loss, on behalf of their community over the winter. And that's really important to see that as part of the community cohesion. How those enterprises are going to do that this winter is very difficult to say. Obviously, some businesses have fallen through the gaps in funding support. Fishing businesses that have been over-dependent on export markets in the past, they've collapsed, so that is really challenging. And local economies, as we've seen, and I think Kirsten's data so well demonstrates that we're effectively over-dependent on tourism. We must develop local economies which are more resilient and don't depend so much on tourism, because we don't know when these crises are going to happen again in the future. A long-term trend, I think, is actually promising. And I think this is really important to see. I mean, the short term is really dire, but the long term is promising. Even before COVID, we had young economically active people and families returning, settling or staying on many islands based on our research and the Islands Revival blog. And pandemics accelerate trends that are already happening, and the trend to rural living and higher well-being in rural areas will undoubtedly accelerate. There are already some indicators that I've noticed from big urban centres where people are moving out to rural areas. Key issue there will obviously be to prevent urban escapees pricing others out of housing markets, local housing market. That's really important. And there are plenty of good examples of where rural housing that has been built is quickly filled, boosting the local population, but crucially is targeted at those who are economically active will be in the community and bringing families rather than on commuters or retirees. Islands and many rural areas also have extraordinary assets, environmental, community and cultural, social, psychological, all the skills, the multi-skills that we have in our communities, the businesses and social enterprises. And a lot of those have got a lot more emphasis during COVID when people have recognized actually they're really, really important. So they enable local economies like on islands to develop more resilient and sustainable economies and deliver well-being. And I'm so pleased that Sue and Ailsa emphasize that well-being as critical. We also have the knowledge, the expertise, and above all, the lived experience to innovate genuine solutions to the crises that confront our societies. And that's pandemics, that's inequality, the climate emergency. There are solutions that can more easily be seeded in our local economies than elsewhere. So we can be critical laboratories for developing alternative ways of living, which are so urgently required. And you know, when we have all these, it's really interesting to look at the consumption data, which is so important, and yet we also know from the climate crisis we've got to reduce consumption. So how does that match up? And when we're looking at the expenditure of affluent community, affluent individuals, that's really important for many of our local economies, but we can't continue constantly spending on beyond the environmental bounds of our world. So it's a real challenge, that. Where does the public sector fit in? First, invest in the future rather than manage decline. And that's a major mind shift that still needs to happen in some areas of the public sector, because the future is promising, even though the current data doesn't look as great. We need to address constraints on islands. I've just noticed my computer's running out of charge, so link that in, sorry about that. We need to address constraints on islands, and I've listed out, you can look at the presentation later, some examples of that, how energy markets are priced, how housing demand is measured, how services, health and social are delivered. But I've also, in all of those cases, given positive examples of where things are already taken a change for the better. And particularly over dependency on tourism, there are examples where communities have developed themselves to be good places to live as their priority, which then also become attractive to visitors. And the Faroe Islands has particularly pursued that, but there are individual examples like Grimsay here in Uist in the Outer Hebrides. Where do social enterprises fit? Well, Sue and Ailsa have already emphasized how vital social enterprises are. Now, just to give you some stats, even pre-COVID, social enterprise is almost a way of life on the islands. We have by far the highest social enterprises per capita in Scotland. Shetland first, Outer Hebrides second, Orkney third, and then Argyll and Bute, I believe, is fourth because of their island populations. And you can look again afterwards through my presentation as some of the rather extraordinary data of the contribution of the third sector to our local economy. They deliver numerous services, they're involved in most of the development projects, they generate 10% or more of all the jobs. They brought in millions of pounds of investment, and it is millions in a small community like Uist, which is a population of 5,000, and they're heart of the cultural revival. They are critical, they've responded very agilely, very swiftly to COVID, and they are critical in terms of addressing the obvious market failures that arise in very small localized economies. They're very good at addressing that. I would also say, with our emphasis on social enterprise, and of course I'm a tutor for the Social Enterprise Academy, I've worked for social enterprise all my life, but micro businesses are just as critical. And when the further you move away from urban markets and the remoter you move, the boundaries between social and private business start blurring. Our micro enterprises are deeply rooted in the local economies and give us a lot of resilience. Okay, my final reflections then. Again, emphasizing what Sue and Ailsa have said, we need to focus on holistic and integrated communities now. We cannot just focus on local economies and economic data. COVID has brought to the fore how much individuals want and communities want broad well-being. Economic development is a critical part of that, but it's only one part. And we can no longer, that's again a major shift of economic development agencies away from a focus on growth, on economic development, to a much more holistic, how can we be resilient, how can we be sustainable, and how can we deliver well-being to people who reside in local communities. One other final aspect I'm going to say is that the COVID-19 has revealed a deep failure of local democracy and governance. And I've heard it talk about how centralised Scotland is. During COVID, I've realised quite how true that is right on the ground. The islands and rural communities generally have done very well through their strength and cohesion, through all the social enterprises, micro businesses, in addressing the challenges of COVID. And there's a vibrant debate going on at the local level in all the islands that I've seen on what kind of future we want, both socially, community-wise, and economically. But the critical decisions about opening up and reviving our communities are all currently being taken centrally with very little regard to local circumstances. And that is hugely challenging. And we need better governance, and we need better resources and control at a local level if we're really going to flourish as resilient and sustainable local economies delivering well-being to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I've got quite a few questions, I guess some that have come through, and there's almost too many questions to ask, especially given I'm conscious we're going over. So what I'm going to do is I'll perhaps fire back to ask some of the questions that are perhaps more direct for Kirsten first, just given we've done a lot since then, and then come back to Thomas and Ailsa and Sue, if that's good. It was a question just on some of the data, Kirsten. I just wonder whether, is there within the data set a sense of, obviously you told us kind of grocery spend up and we've seen some of that sense, is there a sense from within the data set of a breakdown of how money's spent within SMEs, which we know are critical in some of our smaller communities, versus perhaps the spend in the big five supermarkets, I guess, in terms of understanding that balance? And then the other thing I'm quite interested in, and I think this is, you know, as we're looking at our kind of the future of our towns, of our communities, is also the balance between online spend and spending kind of proper shop, so to speak. So is there a sense from the data in kind of any of those bits of breakdown that also inform key changes?
Yeah. So both of those, actually, we do have those data points because essentially we've tracked according to merchants. So you can kind of, then those merchants get assigned, we can see whether it's a Tesco or if it's a local independent shop, for example. Not all of the local independents have been classified. So it kind of starts, it's almost easier to see the big ones. They're also quite obvious just when you look at the size of transactions, etc. But we do have some of that distinction. I think, though, what's also been interesting is that we can see the sectors and where those merchants fall. And something that that I haven't looked at for the Scottish data in particular, but on a national level, there is at the moment that the areas that have focused on manufacturing and have that as a key economic sector have actually gone back up to pre-COVID spending levels, whereas those that are more retail, hospitality focused, etc. So we can also start to look at where the money is going, not only groceries, but other elements as well. And on the online sales, yes, 100%, there's a huge increase on that, in that data point of online versus kind of in person. Actually, there was one example that I think included in the data specifics would maybe just useful to share. We looked at ward level and we saw this anomaly in Hoxton and Shoreditch in London, and they were kind of 135% increase in sales. And we're like, what's going on? And then we realized that Amazon headquarters is based there. So there's starting to track all of that in the data, yeah.
No, I think that's interesting, seeing that perhaps leads into perhaps what was one of my next questions. I know we've had a strong focus on kind of rural environments this morning, but it's a question really about urban environments. And I guess I was reading on the news here today about one of Edinburgh's long-standing vegetarian restaurants that is about to close. And again, I wonder whether within the citywide data, because obviously there's so many different parts to our cities, whether we can pick out even to a postcode level, because I look and I think, well, that particular restaurant that some people may know which one I'm talking about, but it would come under EH1. It would be an area that's still itself reliant on tourism, but also of people, of office workers essentially, and people really visiting the city. So I wonder whether there's a sense within the urban data of whether areas that have high levels of offices that are perhaps currently empty, or again are reliant on tourism, or can we break down the city data into kind of particular postcodes?
Yes, I mean that's certainly something we've been looking at as well. I'm trying to think what might be helpful to mention. So I think in London, again, I kind of forget which data set we're looking at, because kind of each week we get the new iteration. But in London, for example, there was actually an overall increase in sales. I think it was a small amount, like a 2% or 5% about 2 weeks ago. And we then started looking a little bit further, and it was all in zone 1. Whereas if you go to zone 2 and zone 3 and kind of further out, we started to see more of the hits happening, so kind of negative 30, 36-ish, negative 39-ish, as it starts to go further and further out. So I think that, interestingly, and I think it's led in London in particular by the financial trade, people have kind of adapted to online, are working remotely quite easily. Some of those businesses have actually picked up. We've seen insurance merchants, for example, there's more money going through that. Financial services is kind of pretty constant. So the city centre has actually maintained, although I do think that what you're highlighting in terms of buildings is very much there. So the retail merchants there, I think, would be suffering from not having that foot traffic, but actually there's been some larger companies that have been able to take advantage of that and kind of respond from an insurance perspective or whatever it might be. And then obviously as you go further out, there isn't that ability to necessarily pivot to different opportunities given the different sectors and merchants playing in those sectors. But I think something that's also we're very aware of at Social Investment Business is that business models are going to look very different now and in the future, and particularly those social enterprises that rely on renting out space. I think that's a really important business model to look at, and whether or not workspace in rentals is something that is going to be severely affected into the future as kind of behaviour patterns of working have changed.
Thank you, Kirsten. I guess that's the great thing with kind of some of the technology and the data is you can really break it down into quite detailed bits. And I think I'd just say we'd be really happy to continue working with you to try and understand some of the data in that Scotland-wide context as well, because we all know our own areas, I guess, better than anyone else in terms of really trying to understand what's going on. I just wanted to ask a question coming back really to the kind of the rural now, and what's been interesting to me, I'm based in a small rural coastal tourist town, and I guess I would echo some of what Ailsa and Sue and Thomas have all described, the speed at which small community and family-run SME businesses quickly pivoted and tilted. And what's interesting to me is having been involved and still being involved in the local group here with our COVID responses, we've had lots of money coming to help us deal with COVID, but actually the strong community element we have in our rural communities actually, and I'll be careful how I say this, but we've struggled to spend some of the COVID money because actually people are really keen to just volunteer. They're not worried about claiming their expenses for their work. So we've got money to support them, but they actually are happy to do it for the good of the community. And yet what we will need in our community is much more of the money coming into the recovery phase, I think, because that's going to be when the real challenge hits. And I just wonder whether when we've looked at kind of all of our immediate COVID responses, we've put so much into dealing with the problem, have we left enough for recovery? And then my sense in terms of particularly rural communities is, and tourist towns, are, you know, we're going to lag behind, I guess, a little bit, are there areas that are going to need a stronger recovery response but actually didn't necessarily need the immediate response money in quite the same volumes? And I just wonder whether that would be, I'll ask for Ailsa and Sue to Ailsa, you've got your hand up, and then bring Thomas in.
Yeah, just, I mean, it's interesting, one of the points that Kirsten made as well, with regards to the seasonality in a lot of rural and coastal towns. And certainly that's the feedback that we got during Reset Week. There was a lot of concern that while some of the funds and support mechanisms were available during this period, actually where people were going to start to face real challenges was the back end of the year, kind of January, February time, because they would normally have that greater footfall during the summer months. So I think there does need to be a recognition of varied responses given the geographic and sector based economies that affect different localities. Not sure how easy that is to manage, but you know, similarly within our community here in Kintyre, there have been a lot of volunteers that have volunteered and got things done and not necessarily claimed their expenses and things. I guess from a local perspective, that kind of worries me, because our economy was a wee bit on its knees before we even started with COVID, with the loss of 2 major employers. So again, that resilience also needs to be built in for the longer term sustainability as well.
Thank you, Ailsa. Is there just to get a sense from you, Thomas, obviously from your area?
Yeah, absolutely. The investments now need to go into the recovery, and I see, you know, the seasonality, that's a major problem for how we're going to see through the winter, and I'm not sure how many are going to survive. So that is, we've asked for, we actually, overall as a community, we would have preferred a slower opening up to tourism, and also support for the tourist operators right through to the next season, which will only start at Easter time at the earliest. So that is critical. And yes, absolutely, we need to invest in the recovery now. And I said, you know, you can look at the trends and you can say, well, actually, you know, COVID has made the challenges of small, remote local communities even more challenging, and therefore, you know, we're going to rationalize and reduce and centralize even more. But that's completely the reverse of what we need. Basically, COVID has demonstrated the real strength of living in these areas, and we need to invest in that. And in terms of tourism, I'm working with 2 groups of tourist operators. We need to invest in different ways of delivering tourism, away from trails and quick visits. UIST is renowned for that. People drive through in 2 days, and all the tourist operators I speak to, you know, they say people arrive, they stay for the one night they booked, and then they say, oh, we wish we could stay longer, but they can't because they booked the next place and so on. And I think investing in alternative ways, like Isle 20 has done, digitally providing island experience, they're now moving into providing a service to provide food on islands for visitors and locals, and different ways, more sustainable, more tourist experiences where people stay in a community, really learn about that community, but also contribute to that community. And the Faroe Islands, if people want to know, I can dig up some really good examples from there where they're following that approach.
Thank you, Thomas. I mean, I know certainly I've read things, I guess it was looking at Arran actually in particular, but saying actually the community, and I guess where I stay is the same, the community are nervous about there being a sudden influx of visitors, and they're saying, but we need you. And so there's a real balance between the businesses really needing people and locals being fearful. And I think what I saw coming out of Arran was a sense of just, if you're going to come for like a minimum of a few days. What we don't want is just lots of day trippers who actually don't necessarily help our economic recovery, but increase our risks. So I think that's that kind of balance that we perhaps need to look at. I'm just going to ask Sue's got a hand up.
Just very quickly, you got me? Yeah. Just very quickly, I think, you know, a really key message that came out of the Scottish Rural Action Survey was, you know, you trusted us during the crisis, trust us in the recovery. And I think that need to actually put investment into local communities, and I know that's complicated and it's not a nice, neat system that can be managed by, you know, one agency or whatever. But I think, you know, the energy that has actually bubbled up during this period it would be an absolute crying shame to lose that. And I think we need resources that allow local communities to decide what fits their situation, so that they can actually move this forward. And it's really important that they're at the table when decisions are being made. And it's the democratic issue that Thomas highlighted as well. So I think it's about getting the resources to that local level where they can actually make a difference, I think.
No, thank you. I think I think we've all kind of seen that COVID's shown lots of lessons in terms of how people have responded in very different ways. And, I think we're all slightly nervous that we will end up going back to how things were before, and are all trying to also hold on to the optimism that this has been, actually, as awful as it is, it's also been a catalyst for change in terms of how we see things. And it's interesting you use the word trust. It's come up in quite a few sessions I've run. We've seen people have to place trust in organisations and in individuals like they've never had to before, whether it's chief execs running their organisations trusting their staff to homework, whether it's funders trusting organisations to just do what the community needs and almost not worrying about reporting procedures. And I wonder whether it's I hope that trust mentality stays, but we also need to make sure that we closely, I guess, govern and manage that, because that's what will keep the trust there, is we have to maintain that trust from both sides as well. I'm just going to bring Kirsten in. I'm conscious that we're already 15 minutes over, and I have got one question that got posed quite early on I want to come back in with as well.
I'll just mention it quickly, because I think that what our aim is at CoDeL is also that this data, obviously it's being used by social investors, but it should also be at a level that hopefully some of the community mobilization can use to evidence why you need to be involved in this recovery period, and to actually then take that to, as a group, and as a kind of give you a little bit more kind of backing when going to local authorities or funders, for example, to say, this is why we need to, you need to help us into the recovery phase. This is what we've done. This is specifically why we need to do X, Y, and Z, and almost use that as a way to keep the trust as well. Which I think is sometimes really can be the benefit to having almost objective data, is you can't fight the numbers. This is happening.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to just come in. Just the one question that got posed earlier was, and I guess it touches a little bit on Thomas's point about, actually almost having a desire to ease up and more slowly than what happened. But I just wonder, does the data give us a sense, given you've obviously got the data for the whole of the UK, whether is Scotland lagging behind a little bit because we've eased lockdown more slowly? And does the data give us that sense, or are we starting to pick up, or has it not had an impact?
So this is a little bit of a hypothesis. I think it would be hard to kind of say with clarity that it definitely is a result, but I would suspect that yes, the slow increase, whereas London, for example, has gone a much kind of steeper incline between May and June, is most likely due to the slower releasing of lockdown in Scotland. But I think important to highlight that that is not going to be the case in kind of the coastal communities. So this is really in reference to those specific big cities, so Aberdeen, Glasgow and Edinburgh. The fact that has not necessarily bounced back in the same way as London. I'm sure there might be some implications in terms of kind of maybe more reliance on cultural tourism elements there than perhaps a financial focus in London. But I would suspect over time that those bigger cities will start to see the same sort of increase as lockdown eases up. But I wouldn't expect that of any coastal community, if that makes sense. So then we start to look at the differences across geographies in that as well.
Thank you, Kirsten. I have to say, I think our presentations today have just been fascinating. I feel like I've done a terrible job as host because we're 20 minutes over. And I know we record these, so hopefully the people who I know have left us, we were doing some of those questions at the end, we will send that reminder. And I feel like I could continue discussing this for a while yet, but I'm conscious of time. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that's really contributed to today's session. I think that sense of us all really trying to get the balance of, in essence, this webinar demonstrates it, the size that SIB are in terms of being able to collate the data, and then the understanding of the local groups to really try and put it together. To me, it demonstrates exactly what we should be doing. We should be using that balance of scale and localism and agility as we move forwards. And I think a great session, and just to say thank you to everyone.